Hey, everybody. My conversation with Errol Schweizer, and it's going to be a two-part conversation, grew out of a conversation I had with Benjamin Laura about his book, The Secret Life of Groceries. Because one of the things that book does really, really well is shine a light on parts of the supply chain in the food industry that most people don't know anything about. I have to be honest, I didn't know very much about, um, but that I think deserves to be highlighted. Whether it's the truck driver who's spending, an awful lot of time, 80 hours a week sometimes, to get product from here to there, but just can't make a living doing it. People who work at retail who are barely able to survive based on what they're making. Um, and supply chain issues in terms of how animals are treated that I think raise real questions about the broad ethical behavior of the food industry. And trust me, I'm not saying everybody behaves unethically. I'm not saying every company behaves unethically. But I think there's an element out there, and I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to it. And Errol Schweizer's name came up both in the book and in my conversation with Benjamin Lohr, because he's somebody who was at Whole Foods for a long time, but since leaving Whole Foods has basically carved out a significant niche dealing with these kinds of issues, ethical behavior in the food industry. And sometimes it takes the direction of dealing with organics, sometimes non-GMO products, dealing with the way people are employed in the industry. He's a really, really interesting guy. But the phrase that captured my attention in the book that Errol used, he said, "I'm an asset in an innovation culture, but a pain in the ass in a maintenance culture." And listen, I think there's a lot of companies out there that are in a maintenance culture, but really need to be in an innovation culture if they're going to survive long term. And it seems to me that Errol is the kind of guy who is really, really capable of shaking things up. And you're not going to agree with everything he says. I guarantee you won't. He's worth listening to because he shows a way that the food industry can go forward in a world that is undergoing a lot of change right now. So I encourage you to pay attention. As I said, it's a two-part interview. We'll have part one today and part two tomorrow. I hope you find this as illuminating as I did. Errol Schweitzer, welcome to Morning Newsbeat. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is exciting.
So, as I just explained to the Morning Newsbeat audience, I've never met you, but I immediately wanted to meet you when I read the quote from you in Benjamin Laura's book, The Secret Life of Groceries. And because the quote that just grabbed me was when you said that I'm an asset in an innovation culture and a pain in the ass in a maintenance culture. So give me the context for that remark. Where did that come from?
I think Ben analyzed me right. He said that at that point I'd probably been to too many corporate retreats, and internalizing that kind of bullshit lingo. But it's real. I mean, that's just how I am. I get bored easily. I'm always wanting to mix things up. I'm a shit stirrer. I really just can't stand the status quo, even if I'm a part of it. And I just want to keep turning things over. I'm constantly wanting to improve and make things better. And so when that happens with me, I've worked in nonprofits, I've worked food service, retail, you name it. I have a hard time when things level out. I like when things are challenging and, we're sort of plowing new ground, and it reflects in how I behave.
Was there a point in your career that you realized that you were in a maintenance culture and you said, okay, this is not where I need to be?
It was at the point when people were suggesting I needed to find happiness elsewhere at my at a certain job that I had worked for about 14 years. So yeah, we had, there was a change in the winds, and I smelled something in the breeze that wasn't settled, and wasn't sitting right. And, it wasn't for me.
I've been told I should find happiness elsewhere, but they usually told me on a pink slip.
Yeah.
So what led you into the food business?
Yeah, I've pretty much been in the food business since I've been working, just because, just like with a lot of folks who are just looking for work, it's there, or it was there pre-COVID. I started in the food business in college. I was a deli clerk. I was a grill cook. I was a line cook, line server, you name it, all over, food service, campus cafeteria. And then I helped run a food co-op on campus for 2 years, which was selling at the time what was available from natural and organic products. I even dabbled in veganism for a couple of years. I'd worked in CSAs, farmers markets, community gardens, did, various shifts at other retailers, and eventually found myself at a Whole Foods market after my daughter was born, and stuck around there for about 14 years. Started out as a stock clerk, overnight crew, packing out 75, 100 cases an hour, breaking down pallets, running around with the pallet jack and forklift, doing customer service, you name it. And I guess somebody liked me, and I got picked to move up into a regional purchasing role at one point. I actually ran the New York grocery division. I opened up a bunch of the stores in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, and then eventually made my way back to Austin for a position on the global team. And I stuck around there for about 7 years, running the global grocery division for Whole Foods Market.
Which store did you open up? The Columbus Circle store? Is that yours?
No, I opened Bowery, and I helped open Tribeca and a couple in Jersey. I came to New York right after, I think right after they opened Union Square.
Okay, gotcha. So one of the conversations we have a lot on Morning Newsbeat is about big food. And, I wonder if big food, as I think most people would define it, is very much sort of the definition of being a maintenance culture. I mean, it seems to me that I think it's fair to say that most companies, both on the manufacturing side and the retail side, they find it very difficult to innovate. That they want to maintain, and maybe it's just because they need to make their numbers for this quarter and next quarter, and they need to put out fires, and so there's no ability to innovate. Is that a fair observation, do you think?
Look, most of the innovation in the food industry comes from startups and growth companies and entrepreneurs and, socially conscious individuals who are trying to improve the food system or bring something that's new. And that culture doesn't really exist in big food. What big food is or can be good at is scaling those types of programs. And for instance, I consulted with General Mills for almost 4 years after I left Whole Foods. And they're very much about scaling regenerative and organic agriculture. But in terms of having an innate innovation culture, it's really tough because, first of all, they need to establish that point of differentiation with retailers. And it's primarily bigger retailers who aren't always as savvy about innovation and are primarily focused around trade spend and promotions and category management, planograms, all the technical stuff. And then it's just hard to do that in really a bureaucracy where you've got a lot of layers of management and accountability in a lot of different divisions. So, just sort of that pure innovation, in my experience, 90+% of it comes from the startups and these entrepreneurs and organizations that are really trying to fix something in the food system. But the scaling and implementation and, larger scale execution could happen from big food, but primarily doesn't. And then I think the other thing I want to mention is that the impact of finance on the food industry has primarily been terrible. As you know, there was some private equity impact in some of the big food companies that really just stalled them out for years. And it just, Kraft Heinz is a great example of what did they do in the past decade? And it's only recently that they're trying to think about how to start innovating again. And I think the other side of that, one more quick point, is that what a lot of these companies do is they try to acquire the innovation and fold it in-house. And that's had mixed results too.
Yeah, it seems like when companies, it is far more usual that when companies acquire, smaller companies, they're innovative, they figure out ways, I don't know if it's intentional or not, to sort of drive away all the incentives those companies had to innovate. And it's rare. The one I always think about that they seem to have sort of managed to do it the right way to some extent is on the manufacturing side is Unilever with acquisitions like, say, Ben & Jerry's. Now, I'm sure there's lots of examples in Unilever where they haven't done it. For some reason, that brand they seem to have left alone to a greater degree than you often see. Is that a good example, or am I drinking the Kool-Aid on that one?
No, you're not, because it's a structural example. Legally, they separated it, and it and there's relationships at the top, but they get to run their business.
Right.
I think that's the important thing with most companies, whether it's Pepsi or Coke or Hanes Celestial is notorious for this, is they fold the new companies in to their organization, and they pretty much cut out all the additional expenses, which is usually their sales and product development, some of their marketing folks, and just budget that into their current organization. And that is really the structural reason for why that type of energy and interest kind of disappears during a lot of these acquisitions. And it's not always the case. I do credit General Mills for still doing some really interesting work on Annie's and Epic Bar. Danone is trying to do that with a bunch of the companies that they've acquired, and they also have a venture capital division, Danone Ventures. But for the most part, I do feel it's mostly been pretty disappointing. If you were expecting things to keep getting better or stay interesting, but for the most part, it's really about these folks just trying to bank whatever revenue they could get off of just pumping that stuff into the market as is.
Is there a way that companies could create incentives? And I don't mean necessarily financial incentives, but to me, it always seems like there's very little incentive to continue innovating, or to start innovating if you haven't had an innovation culture. I'm just wondering, how could you incent organizations structurally, financially, or whatever to shift from a culture of maintenance to a culture of innovation, even if that's possible?
I think there's a lot to do with the ownership and the governance of those companies and what their priorities are and how they see themselves in the marketplace. I think it's very difficult for either these big private equity backed groups or publicly traded companies to justify that to their big shareholders, particularly institutional shareholders who just don't get it. If it's a privately held company, or if it's a cooperative, it's an employee-owned company, it's a little different, where I think their stakeholders are much closer to not only the business, but to the customers. And that's really where a lot of this comes from. It's finding new customer needs to fulfill.
So when the story came out, or the announcement was made by the Business Roundtable a couple of months ago, that they were, as a group, saying we should no longer say that profits are the most important thing, did you raise your hand in victory, or did you roll your eyes because you figured it was just so much PR pablum?
Look, if you're going to drive another stake through the heart of the bloated corpse of Milton Friedman as he rolls over in his grave, good. I think that's a good thing for the world in terms of their sincerity or their ability to execute that. Meh. I think the intention is there in terms of, the structural issues around ownership and governance and equity, and being really in touch with, especially this younger cohort of consumers. I remain skeptical.
Well, and I suppose we'll know more in 2 or 3 years, because people will go back and do stories about, okay, they made the promise, did they deliver on it? Much the same way as this week there was a story in the New York Times about companies that had said, oh no, we need to make our boards more diverse. And in fact, in very few cases has that actually happened.
It's going to be a slow, protracted struggle it's not just about diversity, but it's about equity, it's about ownership, it's about governance. That is more reflective of the United States and who lives here and who shops.
So in this kind of COVID era, 10 months ago, 9 months ago, I know there were a bunch of stories that I kind of pointed out on Morning Newsbeat that talked about how people's trust in big food was eroding, that people were, and I think some of it was probably overstated, but I do think that there seemed to be a growing appreciation for smaller, more innovative, more entrepreneurial companies, at least in certain parts of the U.S. We can talk about other parts of the U.S., a little later. But certainly COVID seems to have given big food a breath of fresh air, in the sense that people really appreciated big companies with big supply chains that could just get, toilet paper and cornflakes and cookies and pasta and sauce, however mainstream they happen to be, and however unhealthy some of these products may happen to be, just onto store shelves. People seem to be more appreciative of big food than ever before. Is that a step backwards in terms of where we were headed?
Well, I think you just saw the mouth of the crisis, and we don't know how far down the gullet we're going to have to go to get out the other end, frankly. I have friends in finance who think that we may not pull out of it until end of 2021 or 22. And that's, whether or not there's a vaccine or treatment. And I think the problem in the United States is there's so much inequality, and the health outcomes of folks who've been impacted by COVID primarily impact Black, Latino, poorer folks, that it's a really limited analysis to say that, oh, big food has benefited from it. They got a little pop because everybody went into a bunker mentality, and folks were able to grab, if they had the resources, what was there. But we're also talking about a country where there's 20% food insecurity in many states. Here in Austin, one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, there's 18% food insecurity among adults, 26% among children. That's a travesty. So where's big food in terms of addressing that? I mean, I'm sure that they're trying to put in some donations and working with Feeding America, but it's not getting to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, in terms of why people may have, shifted some of their, purchase habits temporarily is inequality, and, just the disruption in the marketplace, and people losing their jobs, and this country not really having much of a safety net for working people. So there's a lot more to it. And I do believe that there is still room for innovation. I work with a number of companies in organic, natural products, and cannabis products. Like, business is still growing, business is still strong. A lot of companies that have figured out how to sell through the internet, various e-commerce models, or working with retailers in their second or third party e-commerce programs, that they're still growing. The problem has been in the supply chain, distributors consolidating SKUs, retailers doing SKU rationalization, and kicking out a lot of products that they feel, hey, this isn't going to work right now. And whether or not customers notice right away or start demanding, they bring that stuff back, is probably not their big priority right now. So I think it's a forced question. I don't think that it's a long-term trend. I think that the only thing that has grown the food business within the last decade, and probably going past that, is the impact on natural and organic products and non-GMO products and new item innovation. I think it's a short-term formula right now that's primarily driven by fear and insecurity, and folks don't know what's going on. I mean, the other side of that is everybody's going to have to start innovating if they want us as a species to survive global climate change. That's going to require a great deal of innovation to figure out how to keep growing food, distributing food, selling food, as we continue to see this climate chaos.
Okay, there's so much to unpack there. Your point, by the way, is well taken about we don't even know where we are in terms of the timing of the pandemic. I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day, and you said at one point, we're in the middle of this, and then you stopped and said, God, I hope we're in the middle.
I think I was optimistic at the time. It was a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, because the numbers don't look particularly good going forward. But it's interesting. I mean, because we all talk, to come back to the whole notion of food insecurity. I mean, it did seem, and I gotta be honest, your podcast kind of brought this into sharp relief for me, because we were all worried about scarcity. Oh my God, they don't have the pasta I like. They don't have this. We're having to buy brands we don't necessarily know. And yet, for a sizable part of the population, it wasn't really scarce, right? There was not scarcity in the sense that it affects people in poorer neighborhoods, people who don't have the advantages of an education or a job, or people who lost their jobs because of COVID. I think we sometimes kid ourselves as a culture about what scarcity really means. Most of us, I don't think, have any idea what scarcity means.
No, and I really don't take that notion seriously, because we're in a society that chronically overproduces food at the price of keeping the price low. If our first guest was Raj Patel, and he has this really fascinating book, 2 books, The Value of Nothing, and then A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. As me, as a retailer and as a food entrepreneur, just to understand the economic pressures on reducing prices and what the downstream effects of that is for all stakeholders. And, you know, in the United States, that involves keeping farm prices very low, keeping food prices, quote, low, but that also means that, you know, your manufacturing costs, your labor costs, people's wages, you know, the benefits they have, that all gets cheapened out too. So I think it's, when we see that there was out of stocks or brief supply chain blips, for now, recently, it was due to just-in-time inventory, distributors and retailers not carrying a great deal of back stock, managing their assortment very conservatively, and, you know, not thinking about, you know, bigger supply chain hiccups and the possibilities of things happening. And now they've adjusted. And so for the most part, you know, and this is what I was talking about, SKU rationalization, distributors and retailers have kept their supply up on a more limited number of SKUs. And so the sort of this notion of scarcity, I think, was a false narrative. And on the other hand, you really got to think in certain categories, for instance, in, you know, agriculture, you know, hand-picked crops, as well as meat plants. You know, production has continued to increase at the expense of the health and well-being of the folks who work in those industries. And so, you know, I think scarcity is the wrong narrative. Once again, I think it gets back to questions of equity and fairness, you know, and who's actually paying for the prices that we see on shelf at grocery stores. And it was a conversation I'd had with Ben Lord too, who's trying to figure out how, in his book, Secret Life of Groceries, how prices are actually set and how subjective those are. And you know, this whole notion of supply and demand and, you know, classical economics is all complete mythology when you look at the economics of actually how food is grown, produced, distributed in the United States.
In the Raj Patel podcast, there was a staggering statistic that he used, which was, I think it was 7 out of the 10 least paying jobs in the country are all somewhere in the food system. And I think he made the point that doesn't even count people who are sort of being paid under the table, even lower rates.
Oh, not only that, Kevin, I mean, forced labor and trafficking is the grease that turns the wheels in American agriculture. I mean, you have to understand that goes on everywhere, or else we wouldn't have to have organizations like Coalition of Immokalee Workers fighting it in multiple states. I mean, so yeah, and when you look at the known medium wage in the food industry, it's $10 an hour. So that creates downward pressure on everybody in terms of their labor expenses to, you know, not increase that. As much as folks are complaining, you know, at management or ownership levels that, oh, we've got this $15 an hour, you know, minimum wage in certain areas. When you have a $10, I mean, who can survive on $10 an hour and where? I mean, just think about that. I personally started out at, I think, like $7.25 at Whole Foods, and was very lucky and fortunate to move up and around. You know, I'd come from a job where I'd made easily 3 times that much and wasn't used to it at first, but I couldn't imagine staying there. Like, I had to work 7 days a week for several years. My wife was working. I can't imagine what that is like for folks who have to go through that. And that, now we're not even talking about the tipped minimum wage sector in food service, which obviously partially collapsed post-COVID. So it's, you know, these are quintessential American issues that I think it is contingent on us in the food industry to solve, because the better people are able to get by, the more people make, they'll spend better, they'll eat better, they'll take care of themselves better, and that they'll once again come back to benefit food companies, because everybody needs to eat. So I want to make sure folks understand that point.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I've made a similar argument on Morning Newsbeat for, I don't know, something like 18 or 19 years. And I will always get, and we will get emails responding to this now from people who will say, well, you know, we don't need to pay people that much. You don't need to pay part-timers that much. You don't, you know, people are able to find reasons not to pay people a living wage, for lack of a better term. And we'll, you know, and we'll find all sorts of excuses not to do it. You know, and it was amazing to me, even during COVID, when people were, you know, a lot of workers were stressed out, people gave them raises. But took back those raises at a certain point. I mean, they were only essential to the point that they needed them to be essential, which is, I know,
Yeah.
is a cynical way to look at it, but I don't think it's necessarily inaccurate.
Well, I felt one of the heroes of the whole COVID crisis has been the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and they've actually worked closely with a number of big retailers. I think Albertsons, Safeway, maybe Kroger,
Yeah.
to really push for the restoration of hazard pay and the classification of retail workers as essential workers, during an emergency, because they deserve better pay that needs to become permanent, as long as they're having to go in and risk their lives every day, during and probably after this pandemic. I mean, to me, that seems like a good definition of essential. If you're having to risk your life, and the fact that if you don't show up, other people will suffer, then yeah, you deserve hazard pay.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that people seem to have some folks are saying, yeah, it's not as hazardous as it used to be. In some ways, I think it may be more hazardous because people are not paying as much attention to it. Aisles are more crowded. They're not paying as much attention to how many people are in the supermarket. They're not wiping down carts the way they were. Yeah, we're all wearing masks, but I don't feel particularly personally less at risk when I go to a supermarket today than I did 3 months ago.
Yeah, I agree. And like, I don't know a lot of folks in the food industry who say that sort of stuff. Even folks who run businesses, they have different challenges and frustrations with, managing expenses, variable expenses, like, labor and, associated costs with operations of dealing with COVID. But that kind of, those kind of ideas are folks who probably just don't know the industry and don't know what they're talking about. So for me, I don't usually spend much time on it, having, being in it every day and seeing what it's like.
So you talk about, quote, bringing food system consciousness and ethics to the forefront. What do you mean by that?
I know it's a lot of big words. I think it was
Good words.
my PR friends put that together. Look, a lot of what I was able to accomplish at Whole Foods was because I had the power of the purchase order. Where as a retail buyer, category manager, head of purchasing, folks in the supply chain had to listen to us as the mediators between them and the consumers in terms of what consumers were buying. I spent 50% of my time in the data, in the weeds, Excel spreadsheets, pivot tables, VLOOKUPs, you name it. I spent the other 50% of my time with product, whether it was in facilities, it was at samplings and product development, it was manufacturers or brokers, trying to figure out how we can meet customer needs. And I think that's what led us to the conclusion, after years of aggregating data, that customers were buying the more ethically produced products, whether it was organic, which continued to grow steadily during the last recession, 2008 through 2011, biodynamic foods, non-GMO came out of nowhere and pretty much just took over certain categories. It was growing compound year over year, 15, 20% a year for 5 or 6 years, non-GMO project verified. Fair labor, fair trade certifications, and just as an asterisk, they are problematic. They are not a be all end all, but continue to show a lot of growth because there was a desire by the customers not to be eating products grown through the use of forced labor or child trafficking or other means of exploitation. And this is just from reading data. Like, this is from spreadsheets and compiling sales numbers, compiling gross profit dollars, looking at attributes across categories. I mean, I'm a category manager by trade. That's what I did all those years. So looking at data to make an assumption about not only what customers were buying, but what they're going to continue to buy so that you as a retailer can keep the lights on, was very much about ethical sourcing and products that were grown with integrity.
That's the end of part one. We'll have part two tomorrow.